Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about Emily Dickinson. So Dickinson's childhood. She was born December 10th, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was a middle child. She had an older brother and a younger sister, and she grew up in her family home. She's unusual because a woman in her time doesn't usually have a formal education, but she did. She attended Amherst Academy for 7 years, and then she was sent to Mount Holyoke Seminary, now called Mount Holyoke College, for 1 year. Some of her earlier experiences. She was very popular as a young girl and developed strong friendships that she maintained through her entire lifetime. In one letter she wrote, "I am growing handsome very fast indeed. I expect that I shall be the belle of Amherst when I reach my 17th year. I doubt I will have crowds of admirers at that age." And in her teens, her entire family joined the church, but she refused, writing, I am one of the lingering bad ones." So she did not, her whole family went to church, but she refused. So you can tell from early on she was pretty strong-willed. In her 20s, she begins writing in earnest. Excuse me. In a letter to her brother, she teases him for writing poetry. "I've been in the habit myself of writing some few things, and it rather appears to me that you're getting away my patent, so you'd better be somewhat careful or I'll call the police." Her love life. She never married. She had several male friends throughout her lifetime. There's speculation about her close girlfriends in her youth. She wrote very passionate letters, but never sent them to someone she called master. And she had a romantic relationship with Judge Otis Phillips Lord, who was a friend of her father in her later years and even considered marrying him. So he was quite significantly older than her. Wild Nights, this is just one of an excerpt from one of her poems. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury." So she is known for her very passionate feelings and emotions. And this is a copy of that poem that she wrote, Wild Nights. So then her writing years. She actually begins writing in her teens, and she has an intense period of writing for 7 years, from 58 until 65. By the time she was 35, she had composed 1,100 poems. Only a few of her poems were ever published, and most of those were published anonymously. In 1864 and 1865, she was treated for a painful eye condition in Boston. And then in her later years, in 1870, she was visited by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was a lifelong radical, an outspoken abolitionist, advocate of women's rights, and founder of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. During the Civil War, he served as a commander of the 1st Union Regiment of freed African American soldiers. He was an ordained Unitarian minister and a prolific writer. His most highly regarded work was a memoir of his war years, Army life in a black regiment. So again, this would be rather unusual for someone, for a white woman to be visited by this African American man in 1870. That was certainly not the norm. In her later years, she offered her definition of poetry to Higginson. "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only way I know it. Is there any other way?" In her later years, Dickinson appears to have stopped assembling poems. She was putting her poems into booklets and then she stopped. And it seems like she just doesn't do that much writing anymore. Her work is sent to several publishers, and who expressed interest in publishing her poems. In 1875, Higginson read a few poems by two unknown poetesses to the New England Women's Club, and one of the poetesses, who was not named during the reading, is believed to have been Emily Dickinson. Her final years, Dickinson's poem Successes Counted Sweetest does appear in a Masque of Poets in 1878, though whether Dickinson gave permission for it to be published is still in question. Nobody knows for sure if she felt that it was okay for that to happen. This is that poem. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. Not one of all the purple host who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear a victory, as he defeated dying, on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst agonized and clear. So her death. She is quite ill as she gets older. Her father died in 1874. Her mother had a stroke in 75. And then Otis, her father's friend, dies in 1884. And her close friend Helen Hunt Jackson in 1885 dies. And so these are all really very close people to her. And she became ill in 1883 and remained in poor health until she died at the ripe old age of 55 on May 15th, 1886. And she was buried 4 days later in the town cemetery. So some themes and tone with Emily Dickinson. Like most writers, she writes about what she knows and what interests her. She uses images from nature, religion, law, music, commerce, medicine, fashion, and domestic activities to probe universal themes. The wonders of nature, the identity of the self, death and immortality, and love. In this poem, she probes nature's mysteries through the lens of the rising and setting sun. And I didn't put the poem in. That's not very helpful. Anyway, form and style. Dickinson's poems are lyrics, generally defined as short poems with a single speaker, not necessarily the poet, who expresses thought and feeling. As in most lyric poetry, the speaker in Dickinson's poem is often identified in the first person, I. Dickinson reminded a reader that the I in her poetry does not necessarily speak for the poet herself. When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person. So when she's using I, she's not necessarily talking about herself. And almost all of Dickinson's poems have no title. When you see them in an anthology, the title, if there is one listed, will be the first line of the poem. She titled fewer than 10 of her almost 1,800 poems. And again, they're just mostly known by the first line. One of Dickinson's special gifts as a poet is her ability to describe abstract concepts with concrete images. In many Dickinson poems, abstract ideas and material things are used to explain each other, but the relationship between them remains complex and unpredictable. Meter and rhyme. The meter, or the rhythm of the poem, is usually determined not just by the number of syllables in a line, but how the syllables are accented or stressed. Below is an example of a common meter from I'll Tell You How the Sun Rose. Put gently up the bars and led the flock away. So you can see how the words are stressed. Dickinson's verse is often associated with common meter, which is defined by alternating lines of 8 syllables and 6 syllables, 8, 6, 8, 6. In common meter, the syllables usually alternate between unstressed, indicated by the little stress mark over the syllable, and it looks like an apostrophe. This pattern, one of several types of metrical feet, is known as an iamb. Common meter is often used in sung music, especially hymns like Amazing Grace. As with meter, Dickinson's use of rhyme is frequently experimental and not often exact. Rhyme that is not perfect is called slant rhyme or approximate rhyme. Slant rhyme, or no rhyme at all, is quite common in modern poetry, but it was far less common in poetry written by Dickinson's contemporaries. So, if you've looked at Poe's poems, you can see his rhyming, and she just rhymes very differently, if at all. So punctuation and syntax. Dickinson most often punctuated her poems with dashes rather than periods, commas, or other punctuation marks. She also capitalized interior words, not just words at the beginning of a line. Nobody really knows why she did this. Certainly while she was writing, she was not what you would call a published author. She wasn't, and so nobody really interviewed her and asked her, so why did you do this? While Dickinson's dashes often stand for more varied punctuation, at other times they serve as bridges between sections of the poem, bridges that may not otherwise be noticed. Dickinson may also have intended for the dashes to indicate pauses when reading the poem aloud. Again, it's not really clear because nobody asked her, and she certainly didn't write about it or explain it to anyone. Dickinson's editing process often focused on word choice rather than experiments with form or structure. She recorded variant wordings with an A+ footnote on her manuscript. Sometimes words with radically different meanings are suggested as possible alternatives. So when you look at the copies of her poems, because she wrote them by hand, she will scribble in the margins and all over it and write different, suggest other words. Because Dickinson did not publish her poems, she did not have to choose among the different versions of her poems or among her variant words to create a finished poem. This lack of final choices poses a major challenge to Dickinson's subsequent editors. So people who have published her work, they have to select from those original scribblings that she did which word she most likely intended. And it's a best guess because, again, she wasn't around to tell people, well, I really decided to use this word, or no, I'm going to use the third word I put in the margin. Nobody knew. So they just guessed. So some tips for reading her poetry, and just for reading poetry in general. Read the poem at least twice, and read it aloud at least once. Do not expect the poem to mean one thing. There's not a poem about death. She talks about death, but she also talks about living and nature and the nature of death. And so it's much more complex than it just first appears. Try filling in the blanks. Try thinking about what images come to your mind. Because poems are frequently compressed, words can be omitted, so think about what is not there, so what's missing from the page. And look for recurring themes and images in her poetry, because you'll find them quite easily. Get out a dictionary. If you don't know what a word means, look it up. Look at outside sources about the poet. See what's been written about Dickinson or Poe. Read the poem aloud again. Keep reading. Read other poems from the poet to see if particular words or images are used repeatedly, because that will give you a sense of pattern, a sense of theme in her or anybody's writings. Here is Tell all the truth but tell it slant. Tell all the truth but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So this is an interesting poem about telling the truth, but telling it slant. What that actually means is not telling it straightforward, but kind of giving something, making it interesting. So tell the truth, but tell it in an interesting way. So you could say this is Dickinson's commentary on writing, on poetry. She's telling the truth, but she's telling it with some pizzazz, with some slant. So that's one way of thinking about it, certainly. All of this information comes from the Emily Dickinson Museum's website, so you can dig more into her there if you're interested in doing so. And certainly you'll find lots of books and articles in the library about her. So if you have any questions, you know what to do. Post them in the questions and comments folder, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.